But because Cameron is more concerned with the patronage aspects of and not so much who's in command and what they're doing, the Secretary of Treasury, Salmon P. Chase, plays a very assertive role here. And I think that's also because of Chase's personality. There's a story about Chase that someone said, I like this Chase guy. He's a very good man in many ways. But his theology is unsound. He thinks there's a fourth man in the Trinity. But Chase plays an important role here in making sure that McDowell, an Ohioan, gets appointed to an important command. And this is going to be command of the forces that are going to be organized to conduct operations against the Confederate forces that are organizing at Manassas Junction, less than 20 miles from the capital. Now, we got our Jominian steps. Have we agreed on the character of the war? Well, not between Scott and Lincoln. Scott goes along because of the president orders. He goes along with it. But he's still not crazy about this idea of a quick victory. But he is subordinate, and he helps McDowell prepare for this campaign. Next step is the theater of war. Well, if you're going to do this thing quickly with the 90-day troops, you're not going to go all the way down to Alabama. Fortunately, the Confederates have done you the favor in that they have moved their capital to Richmond. And so you study the theater of war. They established their capital at Richmond. You've established yours at Washington. Thus, the next step is taken care of. Choose your base of operations. They're going to be basing out of Richmond. You're going to base out of Washington. So naturally, the zone of operations is going to be the region between Washington and Richmond. So what are you going to do when you leave Washington? Where are you going to find the Confederates? Well, the Confederates have established a defensive position at a place called Manassas Junction. And you see it up here on the map where Beauregard's block is right there. Manassas Junction is critical because these armies, the size of these armies makes it necessary that you have railroad logistical support. And coming out of Washington, the main southward going railroad is the Orange and Alexandria Railroad that leaves Alexandria. So almost by the logistics dictate where McDowell's army is going to come out of. So they're going to follow the Orange and Alexandria Railroad, leaving Alexandria and Washington. Out in the Shenandoah Valley, you've got another critical area. Up at Harper's Ferry, you've got an important railroad junction. So that is naturally going to be the base of operations for another federal force commanded by Robert Patterson. To oppose the Federals in these two areas, the Confederates divide their forces. 22,000 men under P.G.T. Beauregard around Manassas Junction, and about 11,000 men under Joseph Johnston out in the Shenandoah Valley. Now, the Federals outnumber the Confederates in the theater of operations, but the Confederates have a critical advantage of interior lines if they are able to use the Manassas Junction Railroad, Manassas Gap Railroad, that links the Orange and Alexandria Railroad with the Shenandoah Valley. And that's the reason Manassas Junction is the initial point for Beauregard's defense, is because of that railroad junction there. Just a distance from it, you've got a convenient defensive position behind Bull Run, so that naturally becomes Beauregard's defensive line for protecting Manassas Junction, and the ability to reinforce Johnston or himself as deemed necessary. Now, on July 16th, McDowell's army of 33,000 men begins marching out of Washington. Before he leaves, McDowell arranges with Scott and says, we know about Johnston's forces out there. Scott assures McDowell that Robert Patterson's forces will operate in a way to hold Johnston's forces in the Shenandoah Valley so that they cannot reinforce Beauregard. Problem with Patterson's forces, Patterson has 26 regiments. Of them, 19 are scheduled to go home during the week this campaign takes place. So as you might understand, Patterson is going to conduct his operations with a good degree of caution. And because he does so, the Confederates are going to be able to order Johnston to leave the valley and go and reinforce Beauregard's forces at Manassas. The order comes on July the 17th, the day after McDowell's forces march out of Washington. Now, in the legend of the First Manassas Campaign, a lot of attention is given to these femme fatales who lived in Northern Virginia and rode in their hoop skirts and everything like that to ride to the gallant Beauregard and advise him that the redcoats were coming, or what they would consider them the redcoats, right? That they rode to Beauregard's headquarters and told him of the federal forces coming. And because of these gallant ladies of the South, the Confederacy was saved. Great story, okay? However, Beauregard did not need women riding in hoop skirts to tell him the Yankees were coming. It was in all the newspapers, all the federal newspapers. In any case, 33,000 men marching out of Northern Virginia is going to be pretty hard to hide and conceal in any case. So there's that romantic story there, but the reality is the Confederates were aware that McDowell would come out at some point. The timing was just a matter of reading Northern newspapers and watching what happens in Alexandria. And when they find out McDowell is actually marching, the orders go to Johnston to reinforce Beauregard at Manassas. And essentially, the Battle of Manassas is going to be a race, okay? And you got the lines of operations up there, the Jominian ideas. They both chosen their lines of operation to get there. McDowell using railroads. His first effort is to try to encircle a small forward force that Beauregard has at Fairfax Courthouse. This fails because of the inability to keep operational security and the fact that McDowell's troops are brand new. They don't march very effectively or very efficiently, and it's pretty easy. And Beauregard's initial plan, McDowell's, is a bit complicated for them to effectively execute. So Beauregard's able to fall back his forces from Fairfax Courthouse to Manassas Junction. Johnston's forces are going to be able to leave the valley, and essentially it's going to be a race on the Battle of Manassas. Can McDowell defeat Beauregard's forces before all of Johnston's guys arrive? And this comes to the final step in Jomini's strategy approach: attack or maneuver to compel the enemy to retreat. McDowell comes up with a pretty good battle plan. The idea is to feint at the Confederate center and try to maneuver around the Confederate left. Initially, things start out pretty well, but as Clausewitz says, it's luck, fog, and friction. There's all kinds of problems with McDowell's efforts to try to execute what is a sound plan on paper. And with all these problems, there's delays in the marches, there's hesitancy, there's uncertainty, and this provides the Confederates time to get the last of their reinforcements from the valley to Manassas. And as a consequence, the Confederates are able to gain an advantage of the battlefield of Manassas. McDowell orders his men to fall back towards Centerville, but then as his men are retreating towards Centerville, the Confederates manage to get an artillery cannon in a position to fire on the bridge, the one bridge that everybody's got to funnel through, overturns a wagon, the Federals panic, and then next thing you know, instead of an orderly retreat to Centerville, you've got a panic flight back to Washington, D.C., which some of the observers, ho, 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 called the time that tried men's souls, because the Federals ran back to Washington so quickly. And so you have this defeat at this battle, and when it's over, McDowell is going to be retained in an important command, but placed over him is going to be George Brinton McClellan, who has won some victories out in West Virginia and is essentially going to be the central character of the next phase of the war after Manassas. But that's about how far we've got to in this lecture. I want to say we got some time here for questions, and so what are your questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, good day, Doctor. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Bob Shalhoub from the Canadian Army. Mm-hmm. What was the Confederate grand strategy? Because we know the northern one was Anaconda. What did the South try to achieve militarily?
The big objective is don't lose, okay? We've kind of started with kind of this home field advantage. We've declared our independence. Don't lose. Hold on to what we've got. What the Confederates are going to develop after Manassas is largely a defensive approach to defending. Try to defend. You don't necessarily need to defend every mile of frontier. You just need to be able to block the areas where railroads and rivers come into your country. The Confederates undertake this as part of their strategy defensive approach. But in 1862, it's going to break down because it gives the Federals the initiative. And as the Confederates try to defend everywhere, the old saying, you try to defend everywhere, you defend nowhere. They try to disperse their forces on too many points, And the Federals will pick and choose their lines of operations. They'll mass on them. In early 1862, the Federals win a series of victories. So in the summer of 62, the Confederates, with the Federals on the doorstep of Richmond and having gone deep into Tennessee, the Confederates adopt a more offensive strategy. Instead of trying to defend everywhere, they concentrate their forces into field armies and try to take the offensive. And instead of the Federals dictating the terms of operations, the Confederates try through offensive operations to dictate the terms of the campaign. And this, to a large extent, is going to be the strategy of the Confederacy going forward for the rest of the war. Largely defensive strategically, but taking the operational offensive. Again, for the reasons I said, have the initiative, you try to pick and choose where you're going to fight. And in Virginia especially, they're going to love going up in the Shenandoah Valley, because going into the Shenandoah Valley in an offensive way will lead the Lincoln administration to release pressure on. So it's an offensive strategy after 62. Does that answer your question? Okay, thanks, sir. But again, like all good strategists, they're reactive. They will not try to impose a single prescriptive strategy, but they will try to take advantage in local areas when they can. Yes?
What was Patterson doing when Johnston moved towards Manassas? Did he do anything at all, or did he just sit there?
Patterson advanced from Harper's Ferry toward Winchester, but as you can understand, if 2/3 of your army is getting ready to go away, you're going to be kind of very hesitant about it. Johnston's cavalry under Jeb Stuart is going to put up a very effective screen, and that's going to further deter Patterson, and ultimately he's going to decide to fall back toward Harper's Ferry rather than, and he doesn't even get the intelligence that Johnston is leaving the valley. He just does. Again, Patterson is often, he gets a lot of criticism for his conduct out there, but if you understand the basic condition he's got with his troops, he didn't do the job he was doing, but he had serious problems of manpower. I'm not trying to give excuses for him, but the basic problem was he advanced a little bit, ran to the screen, fell back, and didn't even pick up that Johnston had left the valley. Yes, sir.
We hear a lot about the problem of the Union Army or these militias and their short-term enlistments. I'm always curious, what were the terms of enlistment for the soldiers on the Confederate side? This idea they're all noble yeoman farmers defending their homeland, but what was the actual legal situation? How long were they enlisted?
Excellent question. The Federals, their first call for troops are for 90 days because under the Militia Act, that's what Lincoln has authorization to do. Congress is not going to be in session until July, so Lincoln's got to start raising troops on the authority of this Militia Act. And there's also some suggestion that Lincoln may have raised 75,000 troops, hoping the Confederacy would say, oh, you're really serious about this now, okay? You're really serious, well, maybe we'll rethink it. But of course, it didn't have that effect. The Confederacy, from the beginning, they begin doing one-year-long enlistments. And consequently, they're going to have a real crisis in early 62 when they go to conscription, the first conscription act in American history. So that's the basic difference in the manpower there. And that's going to have long-term effects throughout the war because the Confederates get an early start on mobilization, and so they start developing a little bit better qualitatively early in the war than the North does. Of course, over time, the North will catch up qualitatively. They have the quality of the quantity, and it's going to eventually crush the Confederacy. Okay, yes, sir.
Throughout your steps, 2 through 8, whatever it is, you say making a strategy. To me, what you actually are describing is operational planning and implementation. Why did you use the word strategy?
Because that's the word Jomini uses, and that's why I had the asterisk definition up there. Because Jomini defined, well, he used the term strategy, we use the term operations. Strategy, of course, is the bigger Lincoln, Scott, should we invade, what measures should we use, how should we mobilize, what are our aims? Of course, aims are very important because you're trying to win back consent of the people of the South, and early in the war, the Lincoln administration strategically is trying to more conciliate the South by saying, we'll beat up your armies, but we'll be good to your people, and so because we're going to beat up your armies, you don't want to serve in their armies, and because we'll be cool with the people aren't going to want to support the armies, and he tries to undermine the Confederacy that way. It's when that doesn't seem to have worked in 62 that they begin to move towards emancipation and harder policies. But yeah, you're exactly correct. Jomini uses the term strategy, what we term operations. And again, he's writing primarily for generals. This is how you conduct a successful campaign. Now, he says, agree with your head of state on the type of war you're going to be in. that doesn't provide much guidance. That just the assumption is once you've done that, sort of the head of government will keep with the politics, and then the general will then go take care of these steps and apply them using his military scientific knowledge. But yeah, Jomini meant operation. Well, we would mean operations when he used the term strategy. And that's an important distinction when you're, because what strategy is, what the operations is, often ends up being very, very confused in terminology. Yes, sir.
Do you think that both sides understood what they were getting themselves into? I mean, initially.
Scott appears to have been a bit more perceptive than most, that force, you challenge the Confederacy and you fight them, they're going to accept the challenge. And even if you beat them, that doesn't necessarily mean they beat. I mean, in Missouri, it appears to be a perfect vindication of Lincoln. In Western Virginia with McClellan, it appears to be a vindication of Lincoln's thing. Union armies go into these areas, they defeat Confederate forces on the battlefield, and then they begin installing loyal governments that begin acting like loyal governments. Of course, under the surface, Missouri and West Virginia are going to be headaches for the whole rest of the war because you've got the Phase 4 operation, right? You've got to occupy and let these people know, we chased out this government you voted for before, now we're bringing in this new government, and you will accept that. And people oftentimes, sometimes don't. So in terms of seeing how long, Scott's concern was rooted in his study of history. The Civil War in Rome had destroyed the Republic. And he wrote in a very gloomy letter telling the Lincoln administration, really you should endorse compromise policies that are being proposed. If it comes to a war, it's going to be a civil war, and there's nothing more dangerous for a republic than a civil war. And he says, even if we are able